Yaakov Katz is a senior columnist at the Jerusalem Post and fellow at the Jewish People Policy Institute. Welcome back. Good to see you.
Thank you, John.
So there's no dispute that Israel agreed to a three-stage ceasefire with Hamas. And despite a few incidents, Hamas has, for the most part, fulfilled its part of the first phase, as Israel has too, for the most part, except for the fact that Israel refused to enter into negotiations over phase two, despite having agreed to do so. So it would seem, at least on the, from the surface, this is on Israel, not Hamas, for ending the ceasefire.
Well, John, I think that there were a couple of things at play here. Number one was, even though, yes, the 33 hostages in stage one that were supposed to be released were released, most of them alive. There were several bodies there that were also released in that first stage. And Israel and Hamas were supposed to move from stage one to negotiate a second stage, which was to see the continuation of the release of more of the male hostages who still remain in the Gaza Strip, for them to come home and back to their families in Israel. But what ended up happening was there were a couple of violations by Hamas with the way they were holding rallies, the way they had had treated the hostages. And Israel also didn't feel that it could reach a stage where it would see, and we saw this at the rallies, Hamas is still there, thousands, at least hundreds of armed men wearing the masks, wearing those green bands. The way they were parading around the hostages, Hamas has reconstituted itself. It's rebuilding itself. It's replenishing its weapons and its ranks. And this is a huge challenge for Israel. So Israel said, we're not willing and ready to declare an end to the war, but we are willing to continue the ceasefire. And that's where Hamas said no, even though Israel had the support of the Americans who said, we will help extend this ceasefire. Hamas is refusing to do that. And Israel, to put pressure on Hamas, has now reinitiated those airstrikes that we're now seeing against Hamas in Gaza.
OK, there is a lot there. Israel's defense minister said on Tuesday, Hamas must understand the rules of the game have changed. He was referring to the renewed Israeli military offensive, which began Monday. But could that also apply to the ceasefire in some ways, that Israel and the US decided that for whatever reasons, that they needed to change the rules? And the reason why everything has changed is mostly to do with the political survival of the Israeli prime minister.
Well, you're touching upon something here, John, that we can't run away from. And that is that all throughout this war, it has often seemed to be mixed between politics and the national security interests of the country. We saw that just this week when Israel resumed the airstrikes against Gaza. Within hours, Itamar Ben-Gvir, probably the most far-right, most right-wing member of Netanyahu's coalition, who had bolted the government, resigned in January when the first stage of the hostage deal went into effect, was back inside the government within hours of the resumption of the war. Why was that? Because the war is back on track, and that's what he wanted. So when you look at that and you understand that, yes, on the one hand, it's important to attack and to put pressure on Hamas, you can't ignore that there is also the political interest here that helps bolster and increase the prime minister's coalition and get him the votes that he needs for later this month to pass the state budget, which, if it doesn't pass, triggers a new election.
So on the military side of things, again, here's Israel's defense minister speaking Wednesday about the goals of the renewed military offensive. Here he is.
Soon, the evacuation of residents from combat zones will begin again. If they don't return the Israeli hostages and Hamas is not being removed from Gaza, Israel will act with force like you haven't seen before.
Israeli media is reporting that Hamas has managed to reconstitute a force of up to 25,000 fighters. You touched on this. They've reconstituted. This is despite a 15-month-long military offensive by Israel, despite tens of thousands of Palestinians being killed in Gaza, despite almost 2 million people in Gaza in dire need of food. And the only way any hostages have been returned throughout all of this has been through negotiations. So the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome. This doesn't have a military solution, does it? It has a diplomatic solution, and right now we're heading back along that military line.
The military solution is not the solution on its own. It's a means to a political resolution. So Israel can use the military to degrade, to weaken, to destroy, but it will need to have something else on the ground, a new force, a new entity, a new government for the people of Gaza that will prevent Hamas from reconstituting and retaking the reins of Gaza and controlling the Gaza Strip and turning it once again into a place that can continue to serve as a threat to the state of Israel. We need a political option here. We need a political vision. And unfortunately, we don't have that from our government. And I think that is undermining the war. It is weakening us in what we're able to do. And it's a sore point, unfortunately, even 18 months into this.
Yeah, it just seems it's war without end and no outcome here, no off-ramp. Jakob, thanks for being with us and thanks for explaining what's going on here. We appreciate it.
Thank you.